Hey friends, quick trigger warning. Today's episode is going to feature some discussions around sexual abuse and also a parent being on the child sex offender list. So if that's a sensitive topic for you or something that you don't want to hear about, I don't blame you. It's okay to skip today's episode. While we don't get super graphic about anything, it is a topic in today's episode. I'm also going to do my best if you want to just like skip those parts of the episode to include in the chapters the timestamps. There'll be a little TW, a little trigger warning symbol at the beginning of those chapters. And so, yeah, so if you want to jump around, feel free to do that. I understand. People are sensitive to that kind of thing, and I just want to make you aware of that. The other thing before we get into the interview is that Kate has been nice enough to invite me to be on a live stream with her and her co-host Allison to talk about purity culture. And so next Tuesday, July 7th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, we're hopping on Instagram and Substack Live, and we're going to talk about purity culture. And I know they want to ask me some questions about the guy perspective on growing up inside of purity culture, but in general, it's going to be a good time. Hopefully laugh a little bit, trauma bond a little bit. And so I'd love to see you guys over there as well. I'm sure I'll be posting more about it on socials. Links to follow Kate on her socials and make sure you're up to date when that live stream is happening down in the description. So with that, let's get into today's episode. What is good, my ex-homies? It's your boy Jacob Gooden. We're back for another week in the Ex-Homeschoolers Club, and I'm pumped today because I've got a new friend in the clubhouse. Kate is joining us, and so hi, Kate. First of all, welcome to the
Hey, how are you
Ex-Homeschoolers Club.
doing?
You and I got connected because I saw you post something on Threads, and I was like, I'm just gonna shoot my shot, basically. And I shot. I commented on your thing, and you and I started DMing, and
hmm
you have a very powerful story, and I was like, you got to come on the show and and
Yeah,
and
I'm
share it
so
with
excited.
everybody. So I'm very excited to share that with everybody. Before we do that, if you guys are not on the newsletter, get on the newsletter. Okay, there's gonna be a link down below. I send out it pretty much every time an episode comes out. Sometimes in between, it's just resources, books, things I'm reading, life updates, that kind of thing. But it's also how to keep most up to date with what's going on with the show. Okay, it's not very frequent. I'm not going to spam your inbox. You're not going to get emails all the time, but I highly appreciate it if you jump on there. Okay, that's the only call to action I'm going to do right now. Kate, let's get into your story. Tell me a
Yeah,
little
for
bit
sure.
about your homeschool experience. How long were you homeschooled? Was it forever? Siblings? Where did you grow up? Like, let's set the stage a little bit for like what it was like in Kate's life as a homeschool kid.
Yeah, so I grew up most of my life in North Carolina, but we started homeschooling in Maryland, of all places. And where we lived in Maryland, it was Annapolis, Maryland. And guess what day my first day of school was? It was
I'm guessing
9/11.
9/11. Okay. I was
Yeah.
like, it's August, September. I'm thinking, what?
Yeah. No, it was
Yeah,
the
okay,
literal 9/11
9/11.
though. So like
Wow.
literally there were like military jets like flying over our house. Like we like the reason why we started school on that day is we had just gotten all of my like kindergarten textbooks and I was like so excited to join like start school. Um and my mom was like, "Oh, like it's not time yet. It's not time yet." She was trying to get things organized, but then 9/11 hit. And she was like, I need something to like take my mind off this because we lived so close to DC that we had like actual people who worked in the government and the military and all that. Like so many people at our church were like part of like the Secret Service or the NSA or that
Right.
sort of thing. So you couldn't like really ask people like what their job was.
Yeah.
I've heard because it would be like, oh, I can't talk about that. It's like top secret. But so we actually knew like people in those environments and but it took me years to realize that my first day of kindergarten was 9/11 and I realized it years later and my mom confirmed it because we were doing this homeschool lesson about like um all the people who help us like the firefighters, the social workers, the police officers, like all those people. And then my mom turns on the TV and she's like these people over here who are like
Right.
helping like pull people out and that sort of thing. And that's when I realized like, oh wait, like something like scary is going on here.
Yeah.
But it's really the first moment that I remember really becoming aware that the world that I grew up in, like this family values, like safe culture, that sort of thing. What like there was things outside of it, and there was things outside of it that were like dangerous. And I remember there was so much like Christian nationalism that arose after that whole situation. Um, where like and of course like as a kid, like I see these terrorists like going into the Twin Towers. Um, and I'm like, oh man, like the terrorists, they're Muslim, so they must need Jesus. So I was like writing prayer requests in my church for Jesus to save the terrorists. And I was also like trying to defend my home. So like do you remember that game Mousetrap?
Yeah, where you
Okay,
would
so
like
there's a
you
bunch
would
of
build
like
it, right? It would like
yeah,
as you played the game, it would build the mousetrap, and then ultimately it would like you could knock it down, right? Take your opponents out.
yeah. So at the time, like there was a lot of commercials like on Cartoon Network and that sort of thing for the Mousetrap thing, and I like really wanted Mousetrap, and I became obsessed with like writing blueprints for like little Rube Goldberg contraptions. And that was my plan to like take out the terrorists that were going to like invade my home, was to do like a Rube Goldberg contraption that would like catch them in the little cage.
So you were planning for like a Red Dawn situation,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
even
At like 5.
yeah, at kindergarten age. Um, that's wow. That's a little nuts. You know what? It's wild that you bring that up, because like that you bring up 9/11, because like
Hmm.
I was thinking, I literally was thinking about it the other day, because I did do a couple years of public school, so it
Hmm.
happened, and I remember going to school that day.
Okay.
And you and I, when we had talked previously, we figured out like we're of the same age group. We graduated the
Yeah.
same year, that kind of thing. And so it definitely was, yeah, that like that big culture shock, I think, where it was just like, to your point about like the world is bigger than just my house and my friends in that
Yeah.
bubble. It is a lot bigger. So that is kind of a weird thing. I never had thought about that. So you kind of said like that was when we realized the world is a lot bigger
Yeah.
than
Because
just our
I
home.
realized this later, because at the time, like the most traumatic thing about that whole incident wasn't that people died, it was that they took like a bunch of cartoons off the air for like days.
Right.
And there were
Well,
cartoons
we're
that I really
five.
wanted to
Yeah.
watch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I just remember from that situation, like just this awareness that like the world was bigger and that there was things outside that like could attack us, because there was such like a safety that we all felt before, um about like the outside world. So it would it's really interesting first day of school for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Not probably a normal day, to say the
Yeah.
least, but
Yeah.
okay, so how does that then feed into, I guess, once things settle down to some degree, like your homeschool life, and like you said, your mom was kind of like, maybe at a little bit of a loss that day, for like how to do it, a lesson and things like that. But once you guys kind of found your groove at your house, what did a normal homeschool day look like? Was there a normal homeschool day?
Yeah, I would say our normal homeschool day was just going through like all the main lesson plans. We were doing Calvert school at the time. Later on, we did Abeka, which I'm sure some listeners will remember.
Yep.
That was a big one. But it was pretty normal. And I remember with the Calvert school in particular, there was like a bunch of tapes, um where they had like a bunch of like children singing, and I've tried to find them like online to see. But I mean, we had all the major things like reading, writing, arithmetic, like all those sorts of things. I remember it might have been either Calvert School or Becca or both. Like I learned handwriting by like copying down Bible verses. So it was like a pretty normal like homeschool upbringing. So when I was about 6, we moved to North Carolina. Um, and a few years after that, there was a period in between where we met with like a lot of other homeschoolers. There was like a homeschoolers in the church that we met with, and different groups. Um, And then we also joined another organization called Classical Conversations, which I learned later was inspired by the prolific writings of Doug Wilson. um, which who's just a very racist person who yeah, basically the face of Christian nationalism right now.
It's so interesting to kind of go back and look at the things from our childhood that are like we have maybe fond memories of. Like
Yeah.
I just had a DL Mayfield on and to talk about Focus on
Oh,
Family,
yay.
and I loved that conversation. It was great. The
Yeah.
thing that DL does really well is absolutely destroy things like Adventures in
Mm-hmm.
Odyssey, which a lot of
Yeah,
homeschool kids, we hold that very dear to our hearts because it was very influential. And so I think, these, classical conversations is another one that I think a lot of homeschool kids like they hold somewhat
yeah,
dear to their heart because it maybe provided that, community aspect, maybe a
for
little bit more
sure.
of like a standardized teaching thing. But for people who don't know what classical conversations is, can you kind of give us a quick breakdown of like what it looks like and what it is?
Yeah, so Classical Conversations is a homeschool co-op. It's kind of based on this movement in Christian education of getting a classical education with like a Christian worldview. So a very common thing it feels like in homeschooling. So what it meant for us is every Friday we'd go to this co-op where there's a bunch of other homeschool kids. And then we'd learn like different subjects. So there was three different cycles, and each year they'd have what they called like a cycle. Um, so the first one was like cycle one, which was the ancient world to like 400 AD. Um, cycle two was the medieval to the modern world, and then cycle three was more based on like American history. Um, so there's a lot of different subjects that we learned. Like there was some math, there was some science. We learned a history sentence every week, which like I can still recite to this day. Um, we also learned the timeline, which conveniently like began with creation, the fall of the garden, Cain and Abel, the flood, Tower of Babel, unification of Lower Egypt. Like it's just drilled into my brain, but it like really started things from like the creation story, so very, very like Christian worldview based. There's also like integration of like fine arts activities and different things. But the main thing about classical conversations is there was a lot of like emphasis on memorization. So at the end of the year, after you had learned all the things in the cycle that you covered, you would have this thing called Memory Masters, which basically was where like the proctor like asked you questions and you regurgitated everything that you had learned throughout the entire year. So it was very like based on memorization, not critical thinking, but at the same time, like we thought that we were smarter than everyone else because we were learning things that like other public schoolers didn't learn.
My mom always kind of taught us like there's a place for memorization and like the regurgitation learning, and then she's
Yeah.
like, and then there's a space for like the critical thinking area of
Yeah.
learning. And so, like I hated science as a kid, and so she would be like, well, you just got to know it long enough to get through the
Hmm.
test, and then like who really cares? Like enough of it will probably stick that, you're going to be fine. But other things like I had much more like acumen towards like history and reading
Hmm.
and things like that. And so like for that, she was like, you probably want to invest your time into not just like memorizing and then forgetting it, but memorizing and
Yeah.
actually really knowing and understanding, having some thought process around that. And so I think that's really interesting that you bring up that classical conversations is like very focused on just like the memorization aspect of it, where I'm sure it, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it's almost in that kind of more of like a public school scenario where it's like we're just gonna kind of keep going. We have a time frame we have to meet, and so like you better keep up.
Yeah, but also like you were reviewing everything a lot at home like during the week.
Mhm.
So you'd like review it at home during the week and then like kind of be quizzed on it like
Uh-huh.
when you got there. So you were learning it throughout the year. And I did like learn a ton, and I like despite all my mixed feelings about it now, like I do have a lot of affection for classical conversations, and it connected me to like some really cool smart kids. But like also as an adult now, just taking a step back, it's like, oh, like there's some weird things about this, like saying that pledge allegiance to the Christian flag like every Friday morning. Like that there's just some weird like Christian nationalism like adjacent things to it that I recognize. But one thing I
Yeah.
really loved that my mom did, and I love going to classical conversations, and I learned so much there. Like there was a writing class, and
Mhm.
that's where I learned how to write. And I don't think I'd be the writer that I am today without that writing class because it really broke down the fundamentals of everything. But my mom was very invested as a homeschool parent. She always took us on like field trips. She was always making sure like we had the best access to like the information. She took us to the library all the time. And there was such like an emphasis on like that exploratory curiosity learning that like even with all like looking back on homeschooling now, like I love that I got that opportunity to learn how to love how to learn.
Yeah.
um and just have that curiosity. And I think that's something that my mom really instilled in us was to have that curiosity and ask those questions.
I think that's a great point you bring up because I think it's what benefits a lot of homeschool kids later in life is the
Yeah.
ability as life changes and we grow and we transition and we evolve and we change, right? It's like that ability to learn and love learning and seek out
Hmm.
information is
Yeah.
very important, right? It's asking questions. It's knowing I can go to the library and like how to properly research things and like all these different things, right? And
Yeah.
so it really is kind of this like special thing that I've realized like not
Hmm.
everybody has that skill of like
Yeah.
people ask a question and they're like, I'll put it in ChatGPT and I'm like, well, that's not going to give you accurate
Yeah.
information, kind of a deal. That's going to spit out a bunch of nonsense. Here's maybe a better way to do it. And they're like, oh, I would have never known that this existed. And it's like, well, yeah, duh. Like just go ask a historian. You
Yeah.
could do that, right? Like that's not out of the
Yeah.
question. Kind of a thing. Let's just ask an expert
Yeah. Like I just
on
spent a
these
whole
types of things.
summer like researching Leonardo da Vinci because that was what my hyper focus was on at that point in time. And I learned a lot about researching. Learned a lot about like asking questions and learning things, and I love that about my experience.
You talked about your mom's like very much like a desire to like instill like a love of learning in you guys. Does your
Hmm.
mom come from like an education background or she just was really passionate about like I want my kids to have the best experience possible while we're doing this?
Yeah, so she didn't come from an education background. She actually came from social work, but she was just very passionate about making sure that we got the best education possible, and she really wanted us to have like that Christian foundation in life. And I mean, I was really lucky. Like she's an educated person. Like she hung out with people who were scientists who went to like great schools. Like really, I grew up around a lot of really smart people.
Mhm.
So I was really lucky to have people who were so invested in their kids' education. So even if they didn't have like that education degree, they would still get them like the resources that they need to learn.
I think that's important too. That's something that I
Yeah.
think doesn't always happen in the homeschool world is
Yeah,
like
people aren't always
mom,
equipped.
right, mom and sometimes dad depending on, parental involvement type of stuff, but you know, uh, mom and dad take on the burden of like we have to teach everything. But mom and dad
Yeah.
maybe don't understand XYZ. My parents were not scientists. Like that is
Yeah.
just not their area of expertise. So, someone else would come in and help us learn those
Hmm.
things in the same way like my mom is really really great at English. That's what she went to school to do. And so she can walk you through British literature, English literature, American literature, like all of these different things really, really
Hmm.
well. And so, guess what? All of my friends came over and we had book club together. We would write
Hmm.
essays together, and she managed that because she was good at that kind of thing. And so, I think, like you were saying, it's important to put your kids around those people that even if it's not them being the teacher, it's just like they're around, can ask a question, get an answer, be pointed in the right direction. Like that is super helpful.
Yeah. And one thing that my mom did do is when like I got to a point in math where she didn't feel like comfortable teaching anymore, like she and the this might be a little controversial, but she did the Bob Jones tapes,
Ah,
which like Bob Jones University, there's a lot of things about them we won't go into it, but for learning math, they were fine. um, but it was really funny because all the people in the math videos were like from the 80s. It was like so they had like the big hair and like the like I don't know, the old-fashioned outfits, like that sort of thing. So it was like
yeah.
we'd always just laugh at like the people that they had on the screen because the video was like so old, but math is timeless. So
Yeah. You know what's funny is I feel like in our era of homeschooling, we you know, we're more of a product of the 2000s and the 2010s kind of a deal. And so like
yeah.
that, as far as school years go, and I feel like there's a point in there where a lot of the homeschool education like resources like got updated. And
Yeah.
like and so like
No
because I
more big
remember the
hair.
same thing, right? It's like the big hair went away. Like I remember because
Yeah.
my family, we did Matthew C,
Yeah.
and
Oh, we did
the
Matthew C too.
okay, I loved
Yeah.
Matthew C. It, like just made
Yeah, it
so
was
much
great.
sense in my brain, building with
Yeah.
blocks, like it just fit. And so, but I remember his videos, like he had hair in all of the videos, and then all of a sudden one year, guy didn't
He
have any
didn't
more
have hair.
hair because guess what? He had just gone through and that year before had updated all of the
Oh, that's funny.
materials, and so it was definitely one of those things where, yeah. Anyway, what we come
Yeah.
from, I feel like that era of like the curriculums were starting to get updated a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's obviously a lot easier to update curriculums faster than maybe back then, but we were rocking
Yeah.
with some 90s and
Yeah.
80s, it sounds like, uh
Do you ever have
pieces
the
of content.
puppets?
The puppets, I don't remember the
Yeah, we
puppets
had puppets
in.
and Bob
Okay.
Jones. Like the
Okay.
puppets would like teach you the whatever was going on. They'd do little skits and stuff like that.
Okay. I don't know that I had puppets. I mean, you know what's funny is like I feel like there definitely was influences from stuff like that, and so it's very
Hmm.
possible that it happened. Like you said puppets, and my brain instantly went to like Mr. Rogers,
Yeah.
and that kind of a puppet show. But I know that's not exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, I don't think I had puppets. So that's, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Are we talking like human looking puppets or animals or like what?
Yeah, they were like the kind of like I don't know, like a Kermit the Frog type puppet. Like
Okay,
it
interesting. And they're teaching what, history?
all subjects. Like I remember there was one, it was like a clam that like I think it was spelling. I think the clam taught you spelling or something like that.
Yeah.
But I was like, I remember like my sister was a little bit younger, so she got like some of the cool puppets. But my math curriculum, I was like so mad because I got a lame math curriculum because it was all like airplane themed. Um, and there was no puppets. And the math teacher like dressed up as a stewardess, and that's how she taught you math. And I'm like, I want the puppets. I want the puppets to be teaching me.
Yeah. You get used to it, and then you change it up and you're
Yeah.
like, "What is this?" Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I want to quickly go over like maybe a little bit of like the dynamic of your family. Like how many siblings did you have? Where do you sit in that sibling range as well? Cuz like I feel like, I'm the oldest of two, and so like I definitely got guinea pigged a little bit for some of
Yeah.
my teaching type stuff. But like yeah, and then were you guys all homeschooled all the way through, or was there some changes in there?
Yeah, so I'm the oldest daughter. I'm the oldest of all three of my siblings, so there are four of us total. Um, so I have two sisters and one brother who's the youngest. Um, and for me and my sister, the one like right below me, we were homeschooled for most of our school career, I would say. She stopped in fifth grade. And I kept on going into high school. So just before high school, I stopped, and then I went to public school at that time. And then the two youngest siblings, they were always in public school. So we have kind of an interesting mix where I was homeschooled for like most of my career and just did like the last 4 years of like all 4 years of high school in public school. And then my sister stopped in that fifth grade, and the two younger siblings were never in it.
So they don't know the pain, or maybe even
Yeah,
the
or the
pain, but
joy.
also the
Like,
joy. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, there are definitely yeah. I used to. I had a couple public school friends, and I remember telling them, I'd get school done by, lunchtime or whatever it
Hmm.
was, and they would always be like, "Really? You're done with school like already?" Or,
Yeah,
I'd
I
do
had
it
that
over the
happen
weekend so
too.
I could take a day off during the week, or, my family at one point we had a ritual of like during lunchtime we would also watch Little House on the Prairie, and
Oh,
stuff
I love
like that
Little
was just
House.
very untraditional. And so it was always funny to have them come over. They'd be like, "So what's new now? What are you guys doing?" And, at one point it was like, "We have Disneyland passes. So, we, in the
That's
middle
cool.
of the week, go to Disneyland and technically do school at Disneyland, even though that wasn't really what was
Yeah.
happening." Um, kind of a thing. But
Yeah, definitely a lot more flexibility.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So let's talk, I guess, a little bit about like the transition to public high school. Was that a big shocker for you as far as like just the dynamics of school, or like, obviously you had some homeschool community stuff, so you weren't necessarily like an isolated, complete
Yeah.
antisocial weirdo in a lot of senses, but like, was it difficult to transition into a public school setting, or did you actually like thrive there?
Yeah, so I think it was really interesting, and I always get asked like, was the transition difficult? And for me, like, I don't think it's not as difficult as you would think. I feel like for an awkward homeschool kid, like I was still like an awkward teenager, but like it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. Um, I think there was different aspects about like just the peers that I was around were a lot different. That was difficult. So a lot of my friends were actually Mormon because the Mormon kids often had like the same, I don't know, there's just like a certain wholesomeness that a lot of homeschool kids seem to have. And the Mormon kids seem to have like that same wholesomeness. Um, so I really like connected with the Mormon kids and I'm still friends with them like to this day, which is funny. Um, but I also like homeschool was like the first time that I met like I found out what gay was because to before like gay was like I don't know like something bad someone called you like oh you're so gay like
Right.
that whole era of people saying that but it was like I didn't know what a gay person was until high school and then suddenly like I was in a writers group and all of my friends were like queer in some way.
So yeah, you got that exposure to like,
Yeah,
okay, the world is a little bit bigger than
yeah, it's different.
you know, like you said, there's obviously a big emphasis on like Christianity and religion playing a role in your homeschool environment, and sometimes things just don't get talked about because they're
Yeah,
worldly or whatever,
for on purpose.
or like you, yeah, or like you were saying, gay was just a bad word in a lot of senses,
Yeah,
and so not really fully understanding what that is, and then being outside and actually meeting people who are gay, and you're like, oh, okay, this is not maybe what I was thinking it was,
yeah.
in a lot of ways. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is something that, before people come on the show, we typically do like a pre-show interview, and you and
Hmm.
I had a great almost 2 hour long conversation a few weeks ago, and something else we wanted to touch on was, some of the protections that homeschooling doesn't
Yeah.
provide always. And so, I know you've got like a unique story in that, and so I don't totally know where the best place to start is, but like maybe let's lay out, I guess, maybe more of your family dynamic, and like,
Yeah.
who's involved, who the players are, and then how certain things that happened in your life impacted your homeschool environment, and maybe why you went to public school and things like that.
Yeah. So I always like to start with my voice because I think that's a huge part of this story. Um, so growing up in a Christian home, like the daughter of a pastor, there was a lot of like surveillance at all times. Like I always say like I was expected to be like a little theologian and seminary student in a trench coat.
Right.
And somehow also like a perfect angel. So there was a lot of emphasis on like it was very family values era. There was a lot of like parenting like books out there that were telling you how to raise like good Christian kids. Um and a real emphasis on this kind of Christian authoritarian parenting, which like ironically is not the way that my parents like at least when they were having the conversations about having kids, it's not how they started out. They really wanted their kids to like ask questions and that sort of thing. But as they got into having kids, especially with my dad, it became a lot more about like rules. Um, so there was very much this culture of spanking at the time, which I think a lot of us experienced. And what I learned with spanking was that I am fundamentally bad. And I grew up in the PCA church. So the Presbyterians, they believe in total depravity. So it's like, you didn't do a bad thing, you are bad. And that's how your little child brain interprets it. And you also learn that your body isn't your own. And that your voice, doesn't mean anything. So your silence is your safety in that situation. And that's what you grow up learning, because you learn that like if because there are so many rules and some of the rules make sense and some of the rules don't. Like, why couldn't we watch Harry Potter? Why can't I watch this show one day and not watch the show the next day? Um, so there was always kind of like this walking on eggshells, am I going to get in trouble? And then this idea that in order to love me, that involved like some aspect of hurt in that situation. So I grew up like feeling my voice was very silenced, because I wasn't able to speak out against those situations. So then we went into homeschooling, and really enjoyed my homeschooling experience. But when I was about 9 years old, my dad was arrested for the thing that youth pastors are arrested for. He was arrested for counts of child sexual abuse material. At the time, it was called like people call it like child pornography, but it's child sexual abuse material, or SASM. Um, and then our whole world fell apart. Like this whole world that I've been told was safe. This family values culture created this like safety around it, like this safe bubble, wasn't actually safe at all. And that there was actually this like real threat within it, that broke that sense of safety. So we lost a lot of friends, due to the stigma. There was a lot of disruption in our church because at the time, like, it seems like now, like every week you hear about like another youth pastor who's done the same thing, but at the time it was like a very new thing.
Right.
Um, so there was a lot that went on during that time. And for a variety of reasons, I'll back up a little. So my dad was arrested. And then there was a period of time where like we went off and we were staying at family and friends' houses, because we couldn't be with my dad. And he was going through the process of he was in jail for a few days and then he got bailed out. And then there was a period of him just like waiting for the courts to do their thing so that he could have his hearing and his sentencing, that sort of thing. So there was a period of time when he was under like house arrest at our house, and then he got moved to like a friend in the church's house and he lived in their basement for a long time. Um, and eventually he was sentenced to 5 years probation. Um, and we were allowed to live with him again after that point. And for a variety of reasons, my mom stayed. And we talk a lot about like you and I talked in our conversation, there's so many pressures that women face in these situations. And it's really like people that talk about this all the time is like, oh, why didn't she leave? Like the not to date this podcast too much, but at the time, like the Kendra like Duggar situation is going on. And that situation is really reminiscent of my story. And for my mom, like not to speak to her, but I imagine like what was going on is she had 4 kids and a newborn. There aren't a ton of stable resources. You find safety with that in that environment. So where and you also don't have the benefits of like co-parenting with someone because this person is a sexual offender. Not to mention like the family court system like can often side against women. Like so and then there's also a bunch of pressures like within the church to stay in those situations, and divorce is a no-no. Um so there is a ton of factors, and I can't speak for her decision, but I have empathy for how hard that decision must have been now.
Well, you're also talking about like her whole world is being blown up in that
Oh
moment as
yeah.
well,
Like you
right?
can't
It's like,
make
because I'm
yeah.
guessing stay-at-home mom, she's,
Yeah.
her plan is I'm raising the kids, I'm homeschooling the kids, like you know, hubby is taking care of the bills, like we're
Hmm.
good, like that's the
Yeah.
plan, and that all of a sudden is getting thrown out the window where it's like, okay, what do I do now? Do I have to go back to work? Do I have to
Yeah.
do this? Where does the next meal come from? Like all of
Yeah,
those
you
types
have
of
an
things.
employment gap, like
Yeah,
the
and your
institutions
community
and
starts also isolating you because
yeah.
that's unfortunately what happens sometimes in the church is like in addition
Hmm.
to your dad getting thrown out, I'm sure to some degree, like also your family is starting to kind of probably be pushed away instead when it should be hopefully pulled in closer and taken care of by other people. I don't know, I just,
Yeah.
as someone who hasn't lived that, I just feel like it just seems like the most isolating type of environment
Yeah, it's
possible.
the most isolating type of environment, and like I know for me, and I'm sure like my my family, my mom, like everyone felt the same ways. It felt like our whole world was exploding. Like someone had just dropped like this nuclear bomb in the world that we had grown up in, and then like it was in pieces. It just totally shattered, and like you're just trying your best to like keep everyone together, keep everyone safe, like in that situation. So yeah, so and then there's like all this anxiety about like what's going to happen because there's so much stigma on the sex offender registry that I don't think you become aware of until you live on the sex offender registry, where it can be very isolating. And one thing I learned much later is in 47 states, ho homeschooling families can homeschool their kids even if there's a sex offender in the home. So you have this isolation and stigma from the church community, people who knew within our homeschool group, and then you also have like the sex offender registry over here, where like friends that we knew from outside of homeschooling and church and that sort of thing, like their parents don't want them over for like good reason, right?
Right, right.
Um, so it can really isolate kids. And then at the same time, because we weren't going to like the public school environment, um, we started experiencing food insecurity. So we didn't have access to things like free school lunch and those sorts of resources as well. Um, and we had like some initial social workers come and check on us. But one thing that my dad said was, don't tell them anything that could have them like take you away from us.
Right.
So it was a very isolating experience, and that I think that's what I want to share with people because it it wasn't I don't want people to judge decisions that were and were not made. I want people to look at, okay, and families who experience these situations because they seem to be becoming a lot more common, and we need to start talking about them. Like who is checking up on the kids? Um, so I was in that homeschool environment for several years. And during that time I was told like if you tell people about our family situation, and this is from my dad, if you tell people about our family situation, like you might lose all your friends again. And it really allowed him because my dad is I want to be careful of how I say this. My dad is an abusive person. I think that's fair to say, and it really also gave him the opportunity to manipulate and control a lot of situations within the home.
Well, you're talking about too, like the idea of somewhat ruling with fear a little bit too of like something that you value as a child is community, is your
Yeah.
friends, is going out and having play dates or going to co-op or whatever those things are. And if all of a sudden the threat is, well, if you tell anybody the bad
Yeah.
things that are happening, this good thing in your life goes away, well, what are you going to do? Probably potentially put up with the bad thing to make sure
Yeah,
that
for sure.
you get to keep the good thing, because if the good thing goes away, then it's just 100% bad things always, right? And so
Yeah.
that doesn't sound like any fun. There is no
Yeah.
escape at that point.
Yeah, so I really learned that my silence was my safety, and that's why I learned in childhood as well, is your silence is your safety in these situation. So it really allowed my dad to operate within that space, and commit like financial abuse. Where I think it was like sixth grade onward, we were working for his landscaping company, um, and earning money, like spreading mulch for the landscaping company. Um, and then like afterwards, if at this point he was allowed to be alone with us, um, he'd have me in the car and it'd be like, "Hey, like, can I borrow some money for you to pay for rent, for groceries, for gifts for your siblings?" So I learned that and then like after he said that, he'd say like, "And don't tell your mom about this." And I knew that if I told my mom about it, then like my world was going to explode again. So I learned that that silence was my safety, and it was also protection, not just for me, but for my siblings as the oldest daughter and taking on that role. Another big part of it was because of my dad's status, like my mom was basically having to act as like a single mom in that situation. And because of that, there was a lot of parentification in that situation. Like my siblings literally called me the second mom, like into college. And there was also because because we were homeschooled and isolated, we were like cleaning the whole house like each week. So like Sunday we do like the whole family of six's laundry. Sorry, Monday we do the whole family of six's laundry. Like we clean and vacuum and dust the living room. Like we clean the bathrooms, and we were doing the work that we were doing at the age that we were was not age appropriate work. And it's like um it's it's like more it's more work than I do in my home.
Right. Well, and you brought up a
Yeah.
good point of the parentification aspect of it. Something
Yeah.
that, you know, it, like you said, you come from it's four siblings. That I would classify that as
Hmm.
a bigger family.
Yeah, bigger for sure.
And so it, something that I saw growing up, like I said, I have one sister, so there's two of us. We
Yeah.
are
It was
for all
normalized.
it's
Yeah.
very yeah, we were a small homeschool family, but the big homeschool families that I saw, especially the ones who had big number, like 12
Mhm.
kids. You know, you see this, and even you brought up the Duggars earlier. We see this on like the
Yeah.
Duggars shows of like the older kids raising younger kids, right? And taking on
Yeah.
more and more responsibilities. And to some degree, I like what you said about there being kind of like uh, not a limit, but like a there, as you get older, it is
Yeah.
reasonable to
There's age
expect more
inappropriate
from
things and
there's
age.
age appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Age appropriate tasks for where your kid is at. It doesn't make
Yeah.
sense to have, in my opinion, a 12-year-old fully mothering a newborn baby in
Yeah.
certain circumstances and things like that. It creates weird confusions and things like that. So, yeah, as someone who has also seen that firsthand from other people,
Mhm.
and it wasn't until later in my life that I even knew how to like vocalize that
Yeah.
was weird. And again, that's not happening in my home. That's in other people's homes, but I'm seeing it
Yeah.
and going, that's like not normal. So
Yeah. And I have like I mean, I I hold my parents accountable for everything. I also have compassion because they were going into this parenting thing like they they were looking at these things and learning that these things are just normal. Um And that was so normalized within that environment. Same with spanking, like the parentification, the eldest daughter stuff, like that was so normalized at the time. Um, and just like taking responsibility within the home. So I don't think like they didn't wake up one day and was like, I'm, I'm gonna like parentify my kid.
right.
But like it wasn't malicious. It was survival at the time.
Yeah. So I'm curious then, like, how or when, yeah, I guess when do you start to come out of that and go and start to find your voice again? Because, like you've
Yeah.
been saying, like, this all really centers around you having that agency over yourself to finally
Yeah.
put your foot down and say, okay, this is not normal. This is not good. So when does Kate start to heal from these things and go, this was not normal?
I went into high school, and then I graduated high school. Um, and during that time, I had experienced like a sexually abusive relationship. There was a lot of like sexual coercion. Like my first kiss was not consensual. Where they had kissed me like when I had already told them like a clear no. Um, so it was a very confusing time because I also grew up during a time of purity culture. Um, and during that whole situation. So the way that I learned purity culture was your purity is like a balloon, and every time you like hold hands with someone, it was like very fundamentalist. Every time you like hold hands with someone, you like hug someone, like not even kissing, you lose a part of yourself that you can't get back, which is wild.
That is a
So
crazy thing.
yeah, it's crazy.
I had very similar lessons in my life too, so you are not
Yeah.
alone in feeling that. But yeah, the value being tied to sexual purity is like a
hmm
very it's a weird thing to unpack
It's
down
a
the
very
line.
weird thing and not biblical at all. But my
Right.
mom like sat us down with these tapes, and we like listened to all the tapes. And then at the end, it was like, okay, like what are you going to save of yourself for marriage? And like little overachiever me is like, well, I'm not just gonna save sex for marriage. I'm going to save my first kiss too. So that having that first kiss taken from me from was like a big deal, because that's something that I had promised myself, but I also felt like it was my fault. Like I had put myself in that situation because I think what purity culture teaches you is not just like, well, I think the thing that purity culture teaches you is sex isn't something you do, or like intimacy isn't something you do for, and this is for girls, it's something that's done to you. Is something that I learned as a girl. So there's almost like, we talk about women in purity culture all the time, but I think there's almost like this placing men as like these predatory people who have no control, and like you're the you are
Yep.
responsible for that like male person who doesn't have control over these things, which is like also a terrible thing to say about men.
Yeah, I can totally speak to this because
Yeah, for sure. You are a
as a
man.
straight white guy, I'm a man. Like these are the things that I was taught, and so I'm thankful for certain lessons I was given directly from my dad, who my dad taught me a little bit more about consent, and he taught
Yeah.
me about um uh context of like when is a
hmm
sexual situation and things like that, and so that's important. But on the flip side of it, getting taught at church or through books that are getting given to us, the way that we're reading it is
Yeah.
that we are uncontrollable animals.
Yeah.
We, it's that it's normal in a lot of senses to very much like be attracted to a woman and have urges and those types of things, which to some degree, yeah, it's like
hmm
it's totally normal to be attracted to somebody, right? It's totally normal to have urges. However, it's then taken to a point of being told that that is an uncontrollable thing
Yeah.
inside of you and there's nothing you can do to like stop it. And it's like, okay. And then so it puts all of the emphasis on the girls
hmm
then. Because again, you and I are also growing up in an area where heteronormativity is like the thing. And so being told that it is a girl's responsibility to make sure that you don't stumble and fall and take advantage of
hmm
her in some way. So it takes all of this responsibility off of the guys. And so it's this really weird kind of thing because
hmm
guys are also being taught, especially in the homeschool environment, like
hmm
chivalry. We're being taught like to be
Yeah.
honorable towards women. And then on like the flip side, we're also being told that like we can't control ourselves around women. It's like a
Yeah. It's
very
weird.
strange type of thing. And to your point about the pieces of yourself being given away anytime you hold hands with somebody, when you hug
hmm
somebody. I still to this day do the awkward Christian side hug when I hug women. And it's something that like I just like I haven't figured out how to break that yet. It's just like a second nature to me of that's just what happens. And then afterwards I go that was really weird and I made that super awkward unintentionally. Um because it's more awkward than if I just gave them an actual hug a lot of
Yeah.
times. And so but it is these things of like you were saying, giving away pieces of yourself for every little thing, kissing, hand holding. Actually, when you have sex or you do any kind of sexual act, it's like these big things that just take away from your value as a person. And
Yeah.
ultimately, even for guys, that culminates in the fact that when you do have sex with somebody, afterwards you feel very worthless. You feel
Yeah.
there is no value in your life. You've given it away. So you're either tied directly to that person for the rest of your life, or you got to go do a lot of soul searching to figure out, what's next after that. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's a little bit of a guy's perspective on the purity
Yeah, for
culture
sure. And
stuff.
that's so helpful and like so needed because we talk a lot about the girl's perspective, but I think the guy's perspective is also important of this whole picture too.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah, so but I think one thing that I learned from that situation is like especially when it happens like non-consensually, it can really make you feel worthless and it makes you blame yourself and not want to come forward about anything that went on. Um, and one thing that I always say is like I when I was learning about, like, sex and sexuality, I only learned about purity, I never learned about consent, and I didn't even learn what consent was until, like, college. Um, so I knew that there were some weird things going on, like, but I didn't realize, like, what it was until college. So that's when my world, like, really started to fall apart, and I started to feel, like, that worthlessness of, like, I because we're kinda given this promise, right? Of, like, if you do all the right things, if you, like, save yourself for marriage, and this is very, like, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, like, you will have, like, this perfect, lovely marriage, and you will have the safety, and for me who grew up in, like, a rough home, like, I wanted that safety in my life, and suddenly I felt like because of what had happened, like, I wasn't worth that safety
Yeah.
anymore. And then at the same time, like in college, I also discovered like my bisexuality and I had always had like these attractions to women like throughout like my childhood and adolescence and sort of thing, but like I had never realized what it was really.
Right.
So like I put things together and I was like, oh, like, this changes everything, and suddenly, like, that we had gone back to church environments, like, after what my dad did, but, like, suddenly, like, this like, any lingering promise of the safety that I had had in that bubble, it was like, "Oh, I don't belong here anymore." And at the same time, like, being part of those environments was very much like especially in my family, it was very much like, you have to have the right beliefs about everything. And the right beliefs are our beliefs. So that process of individuation, I think, was when things started really falling apart. And I started receiving a lot of pushback, where before I'd been kind of like this golden child figure of like doing all the right things and then experiencing the real world and getting a lot of pushback for having so much change in my life.
So how does that like manifest itself for you? Like, are you starting to just be more vocal about the fact where you're like, I don't agree with that? Or is it,
Yeah.
like, um, I know one thing in my life that I get pushback on sometimes from people that I love is like I'm no longer a Christian and so I don't go to
Hmm.
church. And so but
Yeah.
there's a lot of people in my life that don't even know that. So they know me as the version of myself that was very involved in church. And so anytime I see them, I get asked the question of, have you gotten plugged into a good church where you're at? And I go, oh, that's a whole can of worms we can open
Yeah.
up. And I'm figuring out the wording to make it less of a can of worms in that moment, right? Because I'm like, I don't want this to blow up in my face, kind of
Yeah.
a thing. But I get sometimes those weird looks of those people being like, well, if you just gave it another shot, I'm sure it would be okay,
Yeah.
kind of a thing. But so what is that thing for you that's like you starting to, I guess, find that voice where you are getting that pushback from people? Is it just speaking up about things, or is it a lifestyle change that's happening? What is going on there?
Yeah, so I think it's a few different things, and I'm gonna touch on a few different like pillars and moments. I think a big part was discovering my bisexuality, and I had been trying to be good about like joining Christian groups. But then like I started getting exposed to like things like Campus Crusade and that sort of thing, and it felt like a little weird. Where I was like, wait, I don't think I believe what you believe about this whole situation. I was also just getting exposed to different kinds of people. When so I met my best friend in college, who's a black man. And at the same time, like Black Lives Matter was going on. So we had a lot of really great, deep conversations, which I'm so thankful for. And suddenly, like when the Black Lives Matter entered the conversation and people in my life were saying all lives matter, I'm like, yes, but like the house is burning for this person. Um, and so it was a real shift where it was more like this isn't just a political movement. This is like whether my best friend lives or dies. So that was a big shift for me. Another one was I had grown up with a friend who came out as trans, um, like around high school, and the HB2 bill was going on in North Carolina. Um, and I had a lot of conversations with my parents who were like, well, the pedophiles are going to be going in the bathroom. And it's like, well, like it, the situation's already inside the house. Like it was just such a contradiction, but it was like, okay, people that I actually know are being hurt by these policies that are happening. And I was really seeing that empathy that I'd grown up with in my life and really applying it to my life. Um, and then I think just also like, yeah, there was just being exposed to different Christian groups. I had started trying to go to church, but college is busy and you can't always go to it. But I had a few different experiences where my dad like actually called a church to like take me to their church. And it was like a sister church of a church that they were going to at the time. And I walked in and I believe I went to like one of their college ministry things and they said like, oh, so gay people are equivalent to dogs. And it was just like a totally different vibe than what I had grown up with. And like you have to understand, like Presbyterians, they're not charismatic at all. They're very grounded. Like we're the frozen chosen. Like they're very academic, like very kind people. But like I walked in one day and like they were like, "Oh, well, we're having a prophecy update." And I'm like, "A prophecy update? What does that mean?" Like, did someone suddenly like update the book of Revelation? And it was basically saying like, "Oh, the timeline of like Jesus returning is close because the like Muslims are like of the devil like like the United Nations is the new world order, like just all this like
Oh my
crazy
God.
crap. And after that I didn't go to church again because I'm like I just have way too much on my plate to deal with this right now.
A lot changed for me in those early,
Yeah.
18 to 22-ish, right? The college years of our lives,
Yeah.
basically. Like like that time period shifts so much of who you are, I think, just
Yeah.
naturally, because
Yeah.
you, for the first
Especially
time,
with
I
all that was going on
recognized.
during that time for both of us,
Exactly. Well, yeah,
like
you're
gay
talking
rights and
2014-ish to,
yeah, to 2018. There's so much
2018.
shifts.
There's a lot of shifts happening. There's new presidency. There's,
Yeah.
like you were
Trump was a
saying,
big one.
BLM. I lived in
Yeah.
St. Louis, Missouri during BLM, and so Ferguson
Yeah.
happened literally the week I got to college. Like, there was some really crazy stuff. Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, for the national
Mm-hmm.
anthem. Like all this stuff was taking place, and so I think because there was that craziness, there is kind of this call for that young adult person to be like, where do you stand on these things, right?
Yeah.
And as someone who grew up like always being told, like, read the Bible will tell you what to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, like, that's when you're away from home, when you're like far away, like that's what you turn to a lot of times, is that, because you're like, maybe
Mm-hmm.
that church you don't connect with, or it's
Yeah.
not the same, right? You show up and they're telling you prophecy night is happening, and you're like, I don't believe in
Prophecy.
that,
Yeah.
kind of thing. But you're starting to really figure out who you are as a human
Yeah.
being, right? And
Individuate.
right, and so that's, I think, just gonna happen naturally. And so it's
Yeah.
crazy then to start talking about it. I think there's a lot of, I don't know if you felt this way. I was very scared to talk about anything that I started disagreeing with people on, because I
Oh
was
yeah.
I was
I was
very
terrified to tell my parents I was a
firm in my
Democrat.
beliefs.
Like,
Yeah, when I got to college, and I was very firm in my beliefs. I was like, I'm a Republican. I believe in guns. I was like,
good luck, buddy.
very similar to you. Yeah, I was like, I didn't realize the racism that I had
Yeah.
inside of me. Like, there was a lot of stuff. I didn't like gay people. Like, I just, those
Mm-hmm.
types of things that I had to unravel those things
Yeah.
slowly, bit by bit, by being introduced to people, that it was like, oh, you're gay. Well, I don't think you're a bad person. You don't come
Yeah.
across as a pedophile. You don't come across as all the things I've been taught.
Yeah.
Same with black people. It's like, or meeting Muslims, right? And like being like, okay, I don't actually think you're bad people. Like I've been told
Yeah.
my entire life you're a terrorist. It's like those types of things start to really like they weigh on you. I think they just make you kind of be like, whoa, what have I been a part of?
Yeah.
And do I actually believe that that's the truth or not? Because
Yeah.
what I'm seeing in my actual experience is very different than what I'm being told is the experience, I guess is the
Yeah.
way I look at it.
No, 100%. And you're right, there was so much going on. And I think there's like also some of the normal college things. Like you have the preachers that yell, like that come to campus, and yeah, you have like the people who like put up the pictures of like fetuses and like that sort of thing. And it's just like there's some weird groups out there. I'm like, this is not the Christianity I grew up with. And then when Trump happened and my dad like was for Trump, I was like, this is not the Christianity I grew up with. Like, this is totally different. So that was a huge turning point for me as well. And just like the whole fake news and just feeling like, oh, this whole thing that I grew up with, that like there are so many beautiful values that I still value that I grew up in Christianity, and really wanting to follow those value. In order to follow those values in my own life, I felt like I had to walk away from the church that I had grown up with. And that idol of Christian nationalism that has just become so prominent in it.
How does that, I think, like, I'm going to say manifest itself for you? Like, and this is what I mean by that. For
Yeah.
me, I hear a small voice. It's like my intuition,
Mm-hmm.
probably. It's my gut
Yeah.
check of like when I see those things, like the back of my head, there is this small voice that tells me, like, yay or nay, basically. It's like, you
Yeah.
agree with this, you don't. Like, or something's off, right? It kind of is it sends up the spidey senses in a lot of ways. And like, for a long time I felt like I was taught by my church to ignore that because that's
Yeah.
not of God. That's
100%. Yeah.
of humanness, right? Which is evil, which
Yeah.
is inherently evil. So I never listened to that voice. And in college, for whatever reason, it clicked on finally that I was like, actually, that voice has got some good things. It's saying some good stuff back
Yeah.
there. Like I'm gonna actually like
I like
tune
that
into that a
voice.
little bit. Yeah, I like that voice a little bit. And even now, is like I'm 29, I'm gonna be 30 this year. It's like listening to that voice that's in my body and telling me you need to rest or this is not right
Yeah.
or you need to get out of this situation. It tells you a lot of different things. It's not
Yeah.
just, good or bad, but it tells you a lot of stuff. Is that do you have a voice like that? Does it manifest itself for you?
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, because a lot of those college years were like really learning how to trust that inner voice. And I didn't trust that inner voice for a long time. Um, because there was so much that was telling me like, you're wrong, that inner voice is wrong, that inner voice is deceitful, like it's trying to lead you the wrong way. But I went for years kind of distrusting that inner sense, that inner intuition, because I was like, "Oh, well, I must just not be saying this the right way. Oh, I must not be, like, thinking about this the right way. So someone is smarter than I am." But then my body starts to fight back in those situations. So I had grown up, in this parentified environment. After college, I moved back, with my family, and in January 2020, my dad was arrested again. Um, and throughout that situation, I had kind of been starting to go back to church with them, um, and trying to really question all the things that I had been taught. So and really delving into the theology of like complementarianism, women in the church, trying to figure out what I actually believed about this whole God situation, that sort of thing. But there was still like the aspect of control of like, oh, we as a family all go to church on Sundays and you have to come too. Um, there was a little bit of a choice in there, but there was still that pressure of like, you should come and join us. But there had been so much in my life telling me like, you're wrong, everything's normal in this family, even though everything was very much not normal. There's nothing to see here, nothing to question. And then that all broke like when my dad was arrested for the second time for like the same offense 15 years later. So during that time, it rocked our world again. And everything fell apart again. And it happened, they had gone to Tennessee, and he was doing some chat stuff online. And the next morning he went down to like the hotel room lobby, and was arrested by some FBI agents. So the FBI agents came up to my mom, and were like, "Hey, like we arrested your husband." So she came back and somehow, like for that 8-hour drive through the mountains from Tennessee, um, she had the wherewithal to like bring us a tray of Frosties. And that's how she like presented the news that like our dad wasn't coming home. Because it literally felt like an alien had come and abducted him. And and suddenly like this person that I knew my entire life, like this facade like came down, because I'd always believed like, oh well, like he was redeemed in this situation. Like he went through this tough thing, but he overcame this quote unquote addiction, because that's how it was minimized, was as this pornography addiction, which is not what it was at all, but it was minimized by the church in that way. And men get tend to get like this reconciliation, like redemption arc. And it's almost like you can kind of make yourself feel better about the crippling shame that you feel. Uh, I'm
Yep.
talking about that in general. But like meanwhile, like women like myself, like you have a sexual abuse situation and it's your fault. And
Right.
you don't have that same redemption arc, like you are ruined. Um so I so in that situation, I found myself being the only person in the home who had like enough of an income where I could pay for my parents' rent. So I was put back into that parentification role again. So there was it was very much repeating the patterns that happened in childhood. And then shortly after that, COVID-19 happened. And then we were all stuck in this house together. We figured out like where my dad had been arrested. He was going through the court system, but COVID had slowed all the court systems down significantly. So there was a lot of time for reflection during that time, of really reflecting on what I believe, what I've been taught my whole life. Were these things actually protecting me? Um, like, as soon as he got in there, he started pushing for forgiveness, and reconciliation. But I'm like, for the first time in my life, because I had always been taught, like, oh, you just need to forgive. And I knew that if I forgave, it would just be swept under the rug. And I learned so much during that year about forgiveness, how abusers use forgiveness to sidestep that accountability. And then also like what that reconciliation like actually would mean. And after about a year, I did see like, oh, well, maybe he's being held accountable to these sorts of things. And so there was this process of grief, and the process of grief took about 5 years. Um, where it might have been like a year and a half, but I got to the point in that situation where I realized that my dad was still doing a lot of the patterns of like that emotional abuse and that sort of thing that I replicated in childhood. So my journey towards healing was really reconnecting to that inner child part of myself. And also reclaiming that autonomy over my body and my voice, because my body had experienced all these different things and it never really dealt with the grief and the of everything that had happened. Like I'd had therapy, but like there was still a lot stored in my body. So I one of the ways that I think I subconsciously like took autonomy over my own body was by controlling my weight and what I ate, how much I exercised, and in adolescence that manifested as like eating disorder kind of stuff. But as I got older, I came to the point where like suddenly my body wasn't like losing weight anymore and it was just stagnant. And I tried everything with the health coach until finally she said, like, I think this might be trauma. And I was like, Oh, I don't know if it is or not, but shortly after that, I always joke I met my inner child during colonoscopy prep. Because you go through this like harrowing situation.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a lot of fasting in it. And for
Right.
the first time, my body was just in survival mode because of everything that I had gone through. And I always explain the nervous system to people like this. Like, there is, like, imagine there are like three states. So there's the red states, and that's like, like we're in danger.
Right.
There's the green state, and that's like everything's calm. The yellow state is kind of like your body is high alert and it's always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And my body had been in that state for so long that it was difficult for it to get out of that state. And
Right.
that yellow state was keeping it um in that hypervigilant state. So I was starting to manifest health issues from that.
Yeah.
Um so going through that situation when I was doing the colonoscopy stuff is my body for the first time like in years was in this parasympathetic state, where it was just like it could finally feel safe because it was in that fasted, like rested state. And I just remember like my inner child like wanting a snack because, and that's when I realized, oh, my inner child was food insecure. And I don't like, even though we had the empty fridge and a lot of anxiety about groceries and if we'd have a roof over our head the next month, because there was a whole lot of financial instability with being on the sex offender registry. I had never put that together. And I realized, like, oh, I need to nourish and heal this part of myself. And I just started asking, like, spending time doing somatic work, spending time just asking her questions, journaling, like, do you want? Because there kind of always been this unwritten expectation that my dad had of like, oh, like you are our retirement plan afterwards. And it's like, do you want to be this person's retirement plan? And she was like, nope, absolutely not. That's way too much responsibility because during that situation, I realized like she was literally carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Um, during that time. So I started doing a lot of somatic work and a lot of healing. I started getting in touch with my creativity again. And I did the artist way. And just really reclaiming this sense of identity for myself. Um, and that process was filled with like, I was doing a lot of different healing work at a time. I was doing trauma therapy. But I think the biggest thing with um, these situations is you grow up learning that your identity is like not something that you should have. Like you should only find your identity in God. Um, and like you yourself are like inherently bad. And I think working with that inner child and doing the somatic stuff is realizing that I'm inherently good. And that my body is good and my body is trying to tell me things. Um, and just like reconstructing that identity that didn't have to fit anyone else's role of what they wanted me to be in my life. And it was really going from that caregiver aspect of this role I had been placed in as a kid to really embracing the creative self that I had been as a child. And it was so freeing. And I remember just like writing down like all the things that like my like little me loved to do. And some of them was art, some of it was writing, some of it was riding scooters, and just choosing a few things to bring that playfulness back into my life. Um, and just also going through all the emotions of grief, because I think it took me 5 years to get to the point where I finally felt like I could let go of my dad and go through that grief of estrangement. Um, and I think so many kids who grew up in the era that we did, are experiencing this now. And it's not like we want to get estranged from our parents, but it's really about protecting your joy and peace. And that joy and peace is really how I've always experienced God, I think. So I talk about the story of when I felt like I experienced what I perceived to be God for the first time. And it was at church camp. And it wasn't in a church pew. It was actually like swimming around with my friend who came out in trans later in life and just feeling this profound sense of joy and peace chasing the fish underneath the lake. Um, And as I got older, I realized that this sense of God, this joy and peace that I have in my life is something to be protected, something to have boundaries around. And I need to protect it from this person who seems to just bring chaos to my life.
Right.
So going through the steps of grief, like people always think of grief as sadness, but it's going through all these different emotions. It's going through that loss of that, like the external hope that they'll change. It's going through the fear that you'll never see them again. It's going through the anger. Like there was just a part where like I was just so overwhelmed by everything. I just broke down in my kitchen and threw a spaghetti squash on the floor and stomped on it and had a little food fight in my kitchen. But it was just like this 20 years of suppressed rage, because like I could never be angry. And going through all those emotions that were trapped in my body, and experiencing them somatically was really what allowed me to work through that grief, and come to the point of healing when I could let my dad go. Um, and that experience of letting my dad go, I went to this lake, like close to my house. It's about 15 minutes away. And I just sat and I did some journaling and I did a little somatic work. And I wrote like this I am poem. And the I am poem, if you've never done it before, it's basically saying all the things that you are. Like, I am the little girl who loved to play in the woods. I'm the girl who loved to play Polly Pockets. Like all the like I am creative. I am empathetic. All the things that I was, all the values that I held in my life, were the things that I wrote down in that I am poem and that letter to my dad. And basically, I'm not going to be this role that you want me to be. I'm embracing all of who I am. I'm not just a golden child, I'm not just a scapegoat, I'm not just this parentified eldest daughter. I'm all of these things. And reclaiming that identity for myself and seeing that identity as inherently good. And something that I was made to embrace, even though it was suppressed by the things in my life. And after that, I think the hardest thing about that kind of grief from estrangement is that there's not really like when there's grief from a death, there's like kind of a ritual. Like there's rituals, there's a funeral, there's all these sorts of things. But estrangement can feel like purposely like cutting off your arm in order to escape because it can be so painful. Um but like you're doing it to protect the rest of the joy and the peace that you have in your life. And one thing that I realized in that situation was that I needed some sort of ritual to like mark the end of this relationship that I had had. So I wrote down that song from The Fox and the Hound, like the goodbye now forever
Mhm.
song. And I wrote that down and I folded it up into a little boat. And I went to this point in the lake and I just listened to that song over and over again and just cried. And I put the little boat in the lake and it was going towards the sunset. And then as I was going towards the sunset, like this fish jumped up. Um, and the thing about my dad and what really been struggling with is the dad that I knew as a kid was totally different than the dad that I knew like at that time. Um, like the dad that I knew as a kid was funny, like he was silly, he just always had a great story. But the person who had turned it into was just like this angry person, this person who commits these terrible crimes. Like they were, and there were still aspects of that person in there, but he had totally changed. And I felt like with that fish jumping, like it was almost like the spirit of the dad that I knew saying like it's okay to let go now. And I just remember like this red-tailed hawk just like going across the horizon and kind of leading my eyes to like that new horizon. And when I look back, like the sun had set and the little boat was gone. And that's when I really felt like I embraced my new identity as a person, where I was able to let those things go and really embrace who I was and my identity.
There's a couple of things that really resonated with me with what you said.
Hmm.
One, going back to the nervous system and talking about
Yeah.
the green and the yellow and the red, I think a lot of us who grew up inside of religion, and whether you're still in it, whether you're not, like there is sometimes this level of that yellow just gets kicked on and you get stuck in it, and
Mm-hmm.
the protection, that just like hyper
Yeah.
awareness of needing to be in protection. And that was something I learned a couple years ago, of like I had some of that. And so to your point of
Yeah.
like doing that work to finally put yourself in your body at this like rest level,
Yeah.
all of a sudden it's like it can be overwhelming because you're like, okay, like I'm safe, and like this is the first time I felt safe in a long time, right? And so then it's
Yeah.
like, for me it manifested itself in like a lot of tears. um
Mm-hmm.
and so
That
and
crying's
as
so important.
somebody, yeah, exactly, it is very important, and now I cry at like dumb stuff.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we literally watched a movie the other night and I'm just like
Oh.
bawling my eyes out, and I'm
I
like, why
cried
am
at
I
Elio,
crying?
like I cried
Yeah,
at Project Hail Mary, like I
same,
cry all the
yeah.
time now, but I had been told that like crying was such a weakness. Like,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah.
and so I think it's to your point of like it's healing that piece of yourself and allowing yourself to say no, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm safe and it's okay that I do this and it's not weakness, it's a part of who I am. I love too what you said about writing down and finding the things that are who
Yeah.
you are, right? And so I am the kid that loves to do this. I am the person that loves to be creative. I love music. I love whatever those things are, right? And putting that down on
Yeah.
paper and really solidifying that identity. The
Yeah.
other thing that I think is beautiful about what you're talking about is setting that boundary and that safety zone for yourself. And so
Yeah.
for you, it's estrangement from your dad. For everybody,
Yeah.
it's not those things. But it is like there is something valuable about recognizing where your lines are and then being able to speak out of
Mm-hmm.
like, this is me, and don't come across these lines. And if you do, like I hold you in a different place at that point, and so
Yeah.
it is a very hard thing to do, especially again, we keep talking about like growing up in
Yeah.
Christianity. That was not something that is afforded a lot of times to you, of like your personal space doesn't matter because it's all about the mission of God.
Yeah.
In
If
a
you have
lot
your
of
own personal space, you must be hiding something.
right. And so but as you read my interpretation of the Bible, and it's funny because like I'm agnostic now, but yet I still, here I
Hmm.
am reading the Bible and reading books about the Bible,
Yeah, it's
and wanting
important.
to understand it because I'm like, that's part of what I grew up with. And so, but one of the things that I think is that I've come more recently to really love about the stories of the Bible is how, when I read the story of Jesus, I read about Jesus loving people for who they are and taking
Yeah.
like stock in the person of who they are. And yes, there are times he calls them to change and follow him and do these things, but he loved all of these people for their individual traits, character,
Yeah.
their skills, all those types of things. And so when we become a homogenized group of
Hmm.
people who have no interests outside of just Jesus, it's really boring, and that's not
Yeah.
interesting, and that's also, to me, not a very good representation of what the church should actually be. And so when you start to
Yeah.
have those very individualized people who have special interests, who have skills and talents and are different in any way, shape, or form, that
Hmm.
to me is such a more beautiful representation of what humanity is meant to be.
Yeah. There is something, and it's an exercise that I think will change a lot of people's lives.
Yes.
That was really fundamental for me. So we talk about like growing up through that evangelical culture. You're told a lot of like what to be. Like there's a
Yeah.
very narrow view of like who you are, what values you should hold, and that sort of thing. And one thing that was transformational for me as I was starting that process of individuation was just write down 5 values that you hold in your life. And like you can look up a list of them online if you like forgot every value that you ever learned in your life, because there's a lot of pressure. Um, but like one of my values is empathy, another one is creativity. And just being able to write down what the values were in my life and whether or not the relationships that I had like contradicted those values or not was really transformational for me, because just having those values as like a baseline like really gave me a platform and a foundation for to build my identity off of. So if anyone's struggling with like forming and differentiating, get finding their identity outside of what they were grown up with, or if things seem like everything's fall apart, like what do I believe now? Like even just writing like 5 values down to like rebuild around could be really empowering.
The other thing I wanted to bring up too was tapping into that green zone, that safety zone. Because,
Yeah.
like, for me, one of the things that I have found does that for me is I do breath work and I do a
Hmm.
thing called yoga nidra, and it's basically guided meditation, but
Cool.
you essentially lie flat on your back and you can do this in bed. It's great. That's the
Hmm.
best part about it. Wrap yourself in a blanket. Weighted
No.
blanket is great for this. But wrap yourself in a blanket and you listen as she walks you through. It's a mix of breath work and self
Hmm.
mantras and things like that. And if you don't have a mantra, it's okay. Usually someone will give it to you, give you some options of things you can say to yourself. But what it does is the idea also of yoga nidra is that you work your way through your body and you focus on
Yeah.
different aspects of your body. So whether it's a certain organ or your fingertips or your fingernails or the ends of your hair, or like all these different things. And for me, it took a while. It's a practice
Yeah.
thing, right? Like
Yeah, it's
that doesn't
practice.
just come naturally always. So I, give it a couple rounds, people. But but eventually you start to feel it. And what it
Yeah.
does for me is it puts me back in that space of being able to feel where my body is at and what is hurting and those types of
Yeah.
things. So when I am exhausted, what is hurting? Am I drinking enough
Hmm.
water? Do my kidneys hurt? Like those types of
Yeah.
things. And so am I getting deep enough breath? Are my lungs aching for more? Those types of
Hmm.
things. Have I been working out too heavily? Are my muscles too sore? Like those types of things, it starts
Hmm.
to put you in touch with your body in those ways. And so
Yeah.
that's a great, like, in addition to creating the list, like you said, I think also having that tool of finding that thing that puts you in that safe space to kind of help
Yeah.
reset you is very important.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up because that was a huge part of my healing journey as well. It's not just forming that identity, but really like getting in touch with my body again. Because there, one thing that's really hard to do when you're in survival mode, is being grounded and in your body. And by that, like, I mean, there, when you're in survival mode, there's this tendency to disassociate. And disassociation isn't always like, ooh, I'm floating above my body right now. Like, disassociation can look different depending on the situation, the age, everything. It could look like overeating, undereating, overworking, over exercising, like all the overs, right? And I realized I had been dissociating from my life for a long time. So a huge part of my process was coming back into my body and doing very similar to like the guided meditation that you were talking about, like just getting in touch with like the different parts of my body and kind of doing like that guided body meditation kind of thing where I do mantras over like each part of my body. Um and just kind of ask like and visualize what was going on and that part of my body. And I realized that there was a lot of pain stored in there.
Yeah.
There was a lot in there. There was tears, there was like a lot of inner child stuff in there. There was a lot of grief.
Mhm.
And just it really got me started. Now I'm a Reiki practitioner. And I also just have an interest in like traditional Chinese medicine. I'm not a practitioner in that, but it's really interesting from the Chinese medicine perspective of like where we hold things in our body and what things mean. So like often like if your left shoulder is hurting, it can be like a liver related thing. If your right shoulder is hurting, it often relates to grief and things that you're holding. Things like liver qi stagnation are often things like if you're when your like left rib hurts can also often be like stuck grief or anger or that sort of thing. So just having that knowledge like of like where different parts of the body hold different things like really helped me pinpoint like what I needed to work through and what I needed to pay attention to and just like bringing me back down to that body um into that grounding aspect and having that awareness of my body so that I could like have that awareness when it was time to rest and that sort of thing.
One of the things I wanted to bring up as we kind of come to a close here too is like these are the types of things that like you write about And
Hmm.
I know you write about more than this too.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons we got connected again, saw something you posted on social media,
Hmm.
was like, oh, okay, Kate, I vibe with that. Cool. Click. And then it was like, and then I saw something else and it was like, as a homeschool kid, da 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 da. And I was like, okay, click DM. Let's get connected. Kind of a thing. But I want to shout out like where people can go follow you and hear more about
Yeah.
like what you're writing about, maybe stuff you got coming up or stuff you have already dropped, but like give people a little flavor of like if they want to follow Kate Johnson, where do we do it? Where do we get connected?
Yeah, so I have a Substack blog called Quips and Confessionals. So they are essays and humor from by evangelical pastor's daughter. So they're like I'll do some satire. So there's some funny stuff too. Like I recently did a satire of like the faith-based activities from my childhood Bible. I'll also do like essays about like things that I'm thinking about spiritually, purity culture, religious trauma, those sorts of things. So there's a little bit of mix of both, a little bit of fun, like a little bit of seriousness, but I always try to bring in the humor because I think for all the things that we've gone through, like humor really takes away the power in that. Um and can make it not only easier to deal with, but also kind of defang it a little bit. So I try to bring a mix of both. I'm also on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, at Kate Johnson Writes. So I post a lot there about some similar topics, to what we talked about today as well.
Very cool. And I'm going to make sure all that stuff is linked down below. So if you
Yes.
want to go follow, you can do that. Whatever your preferred platform is, go check out what Kate's doing because, and
Hmm.
support a fellow ex-homie, okay? Like that's
Yeah.
that's what this show's all about, right? Um One of the other things I wanted to emphasize before we really go to is like you have gone through some crazy stuff in your life.
Yeah.
And some of those things maybe some of them are a little unavoidable and things like that. But one of the things that I think is scary about homeschooling, and especially like you said, in 47 states,
Yeah.
sex criminals can pull their kids out of school to homeschool them. And
Yeah.
there can be an active CPS investigation, there can be all kinds of things, and they still are allowed to do it. And that, to me, feels like common sense that that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
And so I know I shout them out a lot on the show, but the Coalition for Responsible Home Education,
Yes.
they work on creating legislation to present to our representatives to bring forward as bills that actually like can make change. And so I
Hmm.
know some big stuff just happened in Nebraska and Connecticut, some welfare stuff that does make it a little bit harder for criminals to pull their kids out of school or be around them. It's not a total like we don't accomplish everything all at once, usually kind of a deal, but it's a step in the right direction towards providing more safety and more ability for kids to have access to mandated reporters and things like
Yeah.
that. And so when stuff does happen, there's someone you can go talk to. And so situations like Kate's can hopefully down the line we can start to alleviate some of those things from happening. And who knows? I'm sure there's other things that can be done as well. And but we got to advocate for those things, right? And so, Kate,
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming and telling your story because that's part of starting that process of making
Hmm.
actual change is just actually stating what it is that happens to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm sharing my story because I know that there's other kids out there. Like I said, it seems like a new thing happens every week, unfortunately now. Um, but really my platform is about making sure that we protect women, children, survivors, that they have the resources, the support that they need to do what they need to do in their lives, and that we have legislation that actually protects people, checks up on the kids, like things that will actually help protect kids in the future.
Yeah. I mean, that's the biggest one, right? It's like
Yeah.
most people would agree, protect the kids, right? It's
Yep.
like that seems to be a universal thing, aside from the people who want to hurt the kids, but that seems to be a universal thing across the board for most average American people is protect the kids. And so it really shouldn't be that hard for us to actually make some change in the
Yeah,
way
for
that
sure.
that we operate. So Kate, once
Mhm.
again, thank you so much for coming on. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
thank
it. And you're so
you.
vulnerable and just like, you know, you have obviously, like I said, you've had a tough life and a
Hmm.
tough story, but like I love that you've kind of come out the other end of it as a stronger, better person and someone who, like you said, like
Hmm.
laughing and joking about things and like that can lighten the mood and things like that. And so I look forward to getting to know you more and now having
Yeah.
you as a part of my homeschool friend group.
Oh, yay. I love connecting with other homeschoolers. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been great.
Awesome. And to the audience, like I said before, all of the links to follow Kate down below. Check it out, see what she's doing, and all the links for my stuff. Do all the internet things you know how to do, like, share, comment, yeah, all that stuff. You guys know how to do it already, okay? Send it to a friend, and until we see you next time, peace.